Hello, hi. Okay, we're going to begin. Come in. All right, so welcome everyone to this lecture today. Thanks for coming. This lecture is hosted by the well, we're not really a center at this point, but the Critical Humanities for the Liberal Arts program at AUB, which is a new program that has been hosting this series entitled The Futures Past of Humanity. And I first, of course, have to thank the funders of this series, the Gladys Delmas Kriebel Foundation in New York, as well as AUB supporters, the Asfari Institute, the Anis Maqdisi Program in Literature, and the Center for American Studies and Research, CASAR. And most importantly, of course, to thank Rami, who has done all the work to organize everything and take care of all the details, which are many. I want to just say a few words about the series, and I'm sorry if some of you have heard this before, but it's for the sake of posterity. We're recording all this, and it's online. But the series has, Futures Past series is concerned, and to borrow from Freud, with civilization and its discontents. We've invited speakers from all over the world to Beirut to engage with our contemporary global condition, which is characterized by crisis in authority, crisis in ecology, climate catastrophe, the more general exacerbation of social inequalities on a global scale, which I guess you will address somehow today. And this kind of condition of general crisis that is accompanied by massive advancements in things like technoscience, automation, developments in AI, and so on. And it seems to be that we are in times of great possibilities, but with increasingly dwindling horizons. And the lecture series asks, why is this so? And has invited various lecturers to engage with the question. And most importantly, how can we engage the critical humanities to address these complex and intertwined dynamics that are shaping our present? So I want to basically just move to introduce Gabriel. Thank you very much for coming here and for being with us. It's, pleasure to meet you in person, despite having met you virtually many times. I will say a few words about Gabriel. Gabriel is a psychoanalyst and, well, I can say philosopher, right? Yes. Or perhaps not an anti-philosopher. No. Okay. Gabriel is a psychoanalyst based in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. He's a member of the Research Collective, subset of Theoretical Practice, which I think some of you are aware of, and very kind of interesting formulations that they're coming up with. He's also the author of one of our perhaps most important books on psychoanalysis today, the book entitled The Desire of Psychoanalysis. And I think the subtitle is Exercises in Lacanian Thinking, which came out with Northwestern University Press in 2021. I want to say also very crucially that Gabriel is part of another exciting project, which is the institute called Alameda, which was launched 2 weeks ago, I think, in London. And it's an institute for social research, I suppose, that is also concerned with making possible strategies for actual political organizations, more internationally. And he is the head of social strategy at Alameda. So please join me in welcoming Gabriel, and I'll give him the...
Should I use this one?
Yes.
There's actually a button. Hey, everyone. Is it okay like this? Is it easier like this? Can you hear me? I forgot there's absent people, ghost people are here. Okay. First of all, thank you so much for being here and welcoming here. This very strange project. It's not everywhere that people take seriously the steps we're doing, so I find that ridiculously generous, and hopefully by the end of today, more people are interested in this approach. But it's important to say this is something that I'm not working on alone. It's a lot of people working on this. So probably if you ask somebody else from our group about what I said here, they won't agree with everything. Secondly, something we're working on right now. So if you guys have critiques or ideas, we're looking for people to, steer us in the right direction if it sounds too crazy, or just tell us we're crazy. That would also be helpful. I have a ridiculous amount of slides. I'll try to just pick and choose the ones we talk about so we don't get lost. But my basic idea was to first situate a bit the research we're doing, and specifically amongst different strategies of within Marxism, which I think it's good to understand where we fit. Also, it's good to it's a good way to ask for a bit of patience, because we're tracking back, we're stepping back so much, rather than just discussing what Marx said or something like this. We're trying to take such a back step theoretically that if you don't know where we want to get to at the end, it might just seem totally crazy. So it's good to have that general picture first. And once I give you a kind of idea where we fit, then my idea is to kind of construct bit by bit the basic blocks of what we're working on. So hopefully it will make sense to you. And you will see by the end of it, I mean, it won't be clear from the beginning, but I think it will be clear at the end that there's a very practical kind of consequence to thinking things that in the way that we are approaching them. So perhaps too much in a kind of coarse-grained way, this kind of exaggerated schematizations that don't really do justice to the things that they connect. But just for the sake of situating what we do, we use this very crazy diagram to arrogantly put ourselves next to very important people. And the way you should think about this is the following. We make a distinction between two things we want to talk about, which I think are very important for anyone who's connected to political theory, which is, let's say, the descriptive part of it and the prescriptive part. Holy shit, okay. Thank you. So we want to see, how do Marxists describe the world we're in? So how do they think about domination? Under which terms? What's the concepts they use? And what are the basic commitments they have? And then how does this affect how they then think about political practice, political transformation? So on the one side, we want to see how they think domination, our current situation, and then how do they think about emancipation, where we want to get to. And we chose two very, very broad terms to distinguish these positions, these quadrants in this diagram, which we borrow from, Althusser, but it don't really have to do with him. We just think of it in these terms. Conjunctural means that you're first looking at the particular stuff, and then you're looking at how they relate. And structural means first you look at how things relate, and then you define what the terms are based on that relation, right? So the first position in our little, BuzzFeed test is conjunctural domination and conjunctural emancipation, which is pretty much theories that tend to think starting from specific social situations, and then, for example, the example we give here is world systems theory, which is very much geographically based, very much temporally based. You want to start from historiography, social empirical data, and then you understand what are the dynamics of the forces. Sure, you're going to create complex structural ideas, but you start from the actual stuff happening on the ground. And very adequately, you also think emancipation in the same terms. It's a very, no bullshit approach to stuff. So we fight fire with fire. If the CIA is the problem, you should worry about how to take the CIA down or something like that, right? It's not like about underlying structures that don't change as the terms change. For example, liberation wars and this type of conflict is very much the model for how you fight. So if you have domination, you just go after the people dominating, right? It's much more based on the people, as I said, the terms, than the relations. It's not exactly the type of theory that is going to discuss how, organizing hierarchically always leads to problems. Well, if organizing hierarchically is going to, liberate your region, that's fine as long as you get it done. So it has this nice pragmatic underlying thing to it. But it starts from something very situated, very localized, which is also where its power comes from as a theory. So the second quadrant is one where you don't want to start from specific geography in capitalism and defining different countries, different systems. You start from sort of underlying condition, what makes them capitalist to start with. That's, I think, the general idea of what is called value form theory. So rather than start from specific capitalist dynamics, you start from the fact that to be a capitalist country, you need to exchange everything through commodity exchange, labor markets define so much of social life. So you start from something that is abstract, that is prior to the terms you're going to study, and that defines how these terms relate. right? So the idea of structural domination, that's a concept you'll find, for example, in Moishe Postone, but it's something Michael Heinrich uses as well. I mean, it's a very varied field, but you get that idea. And usually the counter side to this is that, well, we used this idea that there's a structural way that domination works. So but that means that structure is kind of a bad thing as well. So if you want to do something good, usually you need to move to something more particular, something that is not captured by abstraction, something that is not, it's always a bit philosophical, the politics there. You know, just getting things done is never enough unless you also, you know, do something which is almost only visible to a philosopher as good, right? Or something aesthetic, something that privileges singularity, something that privileges subjectivity in a subversive way. So you see that there is a qualitative distinction that we don't get in world systems theory. World systems theory is like, they have guns, we get guns, and let's solve this. Here it's a bit more academic revolution, where it looks the same, but this work of art is actually subverting the whole capitalist society, but it's just like a work of art in a room, right? I'm exaggerating. Of course, there's really good political stuff for people who study value theory, but it's, I'm a very sarcastic person, I'm sorry. But anyway, you get the difference between, there's a qualitative difference between what dominates and how you think about domination, and then you get kind of entangled into how you're going to account for emancipation, for what does it mean to construct something political. Usually you always need to find it in some other field, never in politics itself. So you move to psychoanalysis, to art discourse, to anthropology, whatever. That's why all our departments need to pretty much solve the problems we cannot solve politically these days. Then there's a third quadrant which does the inverse. It starts by saying, look at domination. Domination is direct domination still. It's not true that it's a structural thing with a dynamic. It's just violence with cream on top, right? But ultimately, it's like feudalism 2.0. It's still direct violence, and that's why mediations are going to help us get out of this. So reason is going to get us out of the problem. Impersonality is going to take us away from personal domination. So you see, it's kind of the inverse sign of the second quadrant, right? The second will associate abstractions, instrumental reason. All of this is terrible, and we should find something outside. It tends to aestheticize this other thing. Whereas this third quadrant, which I think it's accelerationisms tend to be a bit like that. Also, this kind of Jacobin magazine tendencies, which are very like, there's a continuation between social democracy, even liberal values. They were just the initial start of something impersonal that's going to lead us even further, right? If the planet doesn't disintegrate before. So you see, it's the inverse sign, but it also has that idea that is something qualitatively distinct between the problem and the solution. The problem is direct, violent, monopoly, irrationality, you know, and if you add reason, if you have a philosopher in your political organization, slowly you're going to move towards something that is, you know, a proper way of organizing things, that is almost more in accordance to the concept of freedom, something like this. So our idea is that we think none of these three positions account for the politics that we do in Brazil, which is where our collective started. Today it's very international, but funnily enough, generally the people that stick with our work are people who come from places where none of these three narratives seem to really do the trick. So the way we try to situate our work is in this fourth little quadrant, which is not that easy to find good examples of what would fit there. So our idea is to, so just to conclude this situating thing, is we want to kind of inherit some aspects of all these three things I spoke of. So we really like from world systems theory that it's not excessively capitalist-centered. I mean, it can talk about many social systems, not just capitalism, which is something value theory cannot. And it has a nice homogeneity between how it talks about the problem and the solution. If you describe the problem in one term, well, that's the terms you need to solve it. You know, if it's an infrastructural problem, you need infrastructural solutions. You're not going to solve it with consciousness, subversion of theory or anything like that. So we want to preserve this methodological principle that the solution and the problem need to have the same grammar. We cannot have two theories, one for the problem, one for the solution. But we don't like to start from something that's so defined by the terms, by the geography, and by the empirical data, because these days, catastrophes are so disgustingly terrible. They don't really get captured by empirical research. It's just too bad to get a feeling for that. Plus, there are questions that don't get solved in this way. The most important one we're going to return at the end is that from the standpoint of world systems theory, everything that happens in the periphery, because it's so heterogeneous, it's so complicated, complex, and specific to the place, it's rarely treated in structural terms. It's as if peripheries are disintegrating, they're more chaotic, and our approach for that is that's the opposite. Peripheries are more logical. It's where you see abstraction at work more clearly, not less clearly. Like our lives are catching fire and the market is fine. So it must be very abstract if it doesn't catch on fire with us, you know? So starting from the terms is not good if that's where you want to get to and that's what you want to think. From the second quadrant, the value form quadrant, we want to start from this structural idea. We want to be able to think about what makes capitalism capitalism and connects different places, even though they're different. But we want to drop this kind of aesthetic, romantic take on what is emancipation. And we want to drop the fact that the way that they connect value to abstraction makes it so that you can't use abstraction for anything else. It's always already you're, trying to quantify reality, and you're always already getting away from concreteness or non-identity or whatever cool term you want. So how do you keep value form theory, the concern with what makes capitalism capitalism, without that added problem, right? And from the third quadrant, we want to keep the idea that, well, sometimes institutions, mediations, you need that. You just don't need it always in the same way, in a continuity with the modern Enlightenment and the way that institutions were thought thus far. So the same thing that allows us to uncouple the problem of form, the problem of institutions, from the theory of value form as the only abstraction that counts, should also allow us to do the same on the side of politics. We want to think many types of organization, not just party politics, not just institutional social democracy or something like that. So how do you treat everything from that standpoint of structural approach, right? So that's kind of the very, very big challenge we're setting for ourselves. Hopefully it's a bit convincing, not that we got there, but that we're on the way. Yeah, so to address this, you'll see we need to step give a very big step back, because what we're discussing here are not really, let's say, specific theses. They are like the underlying language of the theory, right? It's kind of, if you already start by saying, the problem with capitalism is that people are like this and that, then you're committed to some things that will follow. Well, we should change people somehow and this and that, right? So that's at the level of how you speak about it, how you think about it. It's before like the specific thesis you construct about a situation. So that's what we want to change, or at least propose a different alternative. So that's why, to start, we need to go to these very, very basic principles. And I'll try in like 5 minutes, if possible, to explain to you the very strange basic principles we're starting from. If this makes sense to you, you guys no longer need to read Alain Badiou, so I'll save you like a lot of trouble. You just get the slide. So the thing we want to do, which is to be a bit more technical, it would be to say we're generalizing what is in Marxism called the theory of real abstraction. Real abstraction is the idea that when you exchange commodities or when you produce commodities, a bunch of things don't count, and only the invariance of value counts. I don't care what you're going through. I don't care what you think about the commodities or what you're busy about. There is a standpoint from which what really matters is that the value is either preserved or increased, preserved when we exchange or increased when we are produced. So how do you generalize that? So our first idea is to say, well, think like this. In any context, any situation where there's any practice going on, and we will say not even human practice, not even practice itself, but just any situation at all, only some differences make a difference. For example, we're here in this room, and some things matter for what I'm saying, and a bunch of things that are going on right now we don't care about. They could change quite drastically, and it wouldn't affect the logic of what we're doing, right? We call this a logical context, and we call the point of view you need to occupy to only catch what really matters and forget what doesn't matter, the transcendental point of view for that context. This can be really loosely defined. So for example, if you have a thermostat in a room that is like sensing the temperature, everything else can change. Like you paint the room gray, blue, whatever, it doesn't change that the thermostat only cares about the difference in temperature, right? It's kind of abstracting away from differences. It's made in such a way that it doesn't care about a bunch of stuff. We're a bit thermostats-like in this moment. Like there's a bunch of stuff going on. We're trying to remove it from picture because that facilitates connecting what's going on and keeping to the matter, right? So we call this abstracting to just some differences rather than others, a logical context. And what interests us is, okay, under which conditions can you bind these situations together in a way that's coherent? For example, we're talking here and I'm doing a bunch of theory stuff. I mean, if we were to have a different conversation outside, like gossip about something, it would be a different context. But if we were to continue this conversation there, you would say it's more connected. Why is it more connected? Because somehow this discussion here has to do with that discussion in some very specific sense, like you use the same words, perhaps, you talk about the same authors, you will refer to something that happened here, right? So there are some conditions under which this little context, they can be glued together. So we define 3 basic conditions for this to happen. The analytic condition is you can only glue context to other contexts if you can define a minimal unit, like you can tell where differences that make a difference end and the rest doesn't make a difference. So for example, if outside people are saying something else, there's like a construction site and there's some noise, up until a certain level, it doesn't matter, right? If it's too loud, perhaps it starts to matter, we cannot hear each other and so on. So there is a kind of a minimal threshold below which differences don't count anymore. But that's not enough. You need to also be able to find a minimal unit, like a little building block, which might be arguments, in our case here, or slides, or whatever it is. And you need to be able to reconstruct that situation from that building block. So a building block that is too small to preserve the information about what matters for us, it doesn't work, right? So you need to find the smallest building block that you still can glue back together. And third, you need to have a material basis for this, meaning it cannot just be in your head. It needs to be differences that actually have material substrate carrying that difference around. So that's the little weird drawing there. Imagine you're trying to find this little small part, right? That is a significant part for the situation. But what are you actually singling out when you do that? You're taking some difference that exists there. It might be the sound of my voice, some part of the sound of my voice, for example. And you're focusing on that and forgetting, abstracting the rest, right? So it's an abstraction in the sense of forgetting, but it's real in the sense that it's based on differences that are there. They could be removed and then it wouldn't work. If the microphone stops working, something like this, if my voice goes away, everything, well, doesn't work that well, right? So if you manage to find anything that fits these conditions, and we can show that they apply to physical systems, classroom conversation or whatever, but also to much more complex situations. If you can find those 3 things, that means you can start asking how these things will cohere together. You will ask, does the analytic, synthetic, and material aspects of some context glue well with the one that was happening outside, for example, the other conversation I meant, right? And what you start seeing is that you can slowly ask, how do you make bigger contexts, make these differences cohere in a consistent way, right? What is nice about that is that usually when you discuss about the transcendental point of view, like this point of view that constitutes things as being relevant, usually you're automatically talking about something being synthetic in the sense that it gives you a whole. And in our little example, that's not true. We need to keep it up. This thing has to do with the conversation there and with another talk we're going to give and a discussion we're going to have elsewhere. And then in the middle of this, something else happens and we decide gossiping is more interesting. No consistency is there anymore and we lost it, so to speak. So it takes work, objective, material, concrete work to cohere parts of the world into regions. You don't get the synthetic dimension for free just because there is a transcendental point of view, right? You can even imagine this to be very pedantic, as if you're materializing the transcendental point of view. The more everything that matters is coherent with the differences that make a difference to a context, the more you don't need to think about the transcendental point of view to think about it. Like, is this a theoretical conversation? Is this theory? Well, you're in university. It's fully built so that only that differences make a difference, and you might be expelled if other differences make a difference all of a sudden. So, I mean, you have a material basis to make those things abstract, but efficient, right? So it takes more things to create this global unit. And the last thing you need to have is that it's not enough to cohere, to bring together what the things that are happening now and connect them. You need to be able to account for anything that might happen and know how that thing would cohere as well. So if you have a logical context that has these basic gluing conditions, and if you can guarantee not only that the stuff that is happening is glued together, it coheres okay. But if anything new happens, we can still integrate it. We know how to turn any conversation into a theoretical conversation. You know how philosophers go, right? So, or, you know, any conversation is a political conversation, and everything you do is political. Well, that's a way of whatever you say, I'll find a way to extract this particular difference and add it to our little texture, and now things cohere. If you can do that, if you have the means to do that, then you are in a world. A physical world is exactly like that. So this is a general theory that has a place for these real abstractions. It's not a subjective theory. It doesn't really care about what you are personally thinking about a situation, right? It's meant to account for how you stitch together this little part. So this is just the, let's say, very broad idea of world and abstraction that we use to construct what we will mean by value, what we will mean by other things. The value form theory we've been able to show in our collective, something we're working on now, it's perfectly treatable by this. These three conditions I wrote here as B1, 2, 3, and point C. First chapter of Capital, simple form of value, extended form of value, it has exactly this structure, so it's pretty crazy. But that's just world. It should work for social worlds, for your consciousness, for whatever. So what does it make it social? What worlds do we care about when we're doing politics and so on? So we came up with a definition. It's not really, it's just something we are still working on, but I think it captures something important, which is for us, for something to be social, so for us to focus on social worlds, it's not enough for things to be collective, or for things to be human. There can be social structures which are not human, and most of the time when we get together and because we're doing something collective, it's suddenly social and political. It's not guaranteed. It might be absolutely antisocial, asocial. So having a lot of people doesn't make something social. For us, sociality, following Marx and other thinkers, has specifically to do with a type of interdependence between living systems. So it's not enough that you get together with somebody to make something social, even though you can use the term metaphorically to account for that, but it's a way that your life depends on the life of others. That's what's social. So to make that clear, we can just distinguish three ways in which you can have interdependence between living things. I'm going to go really quickly with this, but it already shows how this idea of finding an atom and trying to build something big with it that is coherent with it, it helps to think through this. An organism is a living system, and it's made of living parts, your organs, right? But both the parts and the system are living. That's what we call organic interdependence, right? An ecosystem is already a bit more detached. It's made of living things, but it's not itself a living thing. It's not like a big monster, right? But the parts that matter, the differences that make a difference for an ecosystem, which are the living creatures, they are concerned with their survival, the immediate survival. Like, you don't get, for example, a bird that carries a branch to the top of a rock, the branch drops, some other creature eats the branch, spits something, and suddenly food falls in the mouth of the bird, right? The bird is trying to survive, the other creature is trying to survive, but there is interdependence between these things. So the minimal traits, what I call the analytic condition, what you are going to pay attention to in an animal, is the things that matter to the animal's survival as well. This is the difference with a social system. Like, all the things we do to remain alive have nothing to do with remaining alive, right? I mean, if you are a shoemaker, you make a shoe, you don't eat the shoe. So you make a shoe, you sell the shoe, you get the money, then the money gives you the food. Like, none of these activities has anything to do with survival. It's totally made discrete by this thing. So the interesting thing about social interdependence is that the parts of the system don't really look like they're concerned with survival. The differences that make a difference to the part have other functions. Only on the whole, the survival get guaranteed. So your survival, that's why it's called social reproduction. Reproduction is integrated in the social fabric. It's not that it's binding the animal reproductions in a larger way. That's the difference between ecology and social systems. So the difference that makes a difference in a social system for a living individual, so I care about staying alive, right? But for the standpoint of society, that's not really society's concern directly. I don't have the means to directly remain alive. I need to do something which is socially effective. And after the whole circuit, I will get what I need to remain alive. That's not a capitalist thing. Like, that's even before like proper division of labor, you already get this, you can get this sort of weird form of decomposition of ourselves into parts that don't necessarily directly concern our unity and survival. But because of this, since you're not directly mapping what counts for society directly on the traits that count for the living systems, society can't really reproduce if it has a very strict logic. It clearly diverges from concerns with survival. So you need a very plastic logic to be able to construct a complex social interaction between people. It cannot just be something like I was talking here, like, well, just pay attention to what concerns theory and forget the other stuff, and we will all kind of be talking about the same thing. To make sure we're all integrated socially, you need to integrate very, very, very different things that don't care about reproducing society at all. So you need a very plastic way of binding these little pieces we were talking about. So this leads us to the really crucial part of our research, which is looking for this, we realized that it was a nice way to recuperate a sort of, not lost tradition, but dispersed tradition of Marxists that don't really focus on the kind of stagist account of social life and social history, which starts with tribal societies, and then you get something else, and then you get something else. But Marxists like Karl Polanyi, Althusser in some sense, but not really, but especially this Japanese philosopher called Kojin Karatani, who tried to think about these different modes as if things that happen at the same time. And that made sense to us because we're looking for a very plastic logic for social reality. And he's saying, well, you can actually think of it being plastic because it's the mixture of many logics at once, and you're stitching one thing to the other. And we'll see in the end that there was a very specific reason why this seemed interesting to us, because that's exactly how things work in Brazil. You need to know which logic is the dominant one in every different context. You know, if you don't know when it's a business situation, a personal situation, a situation where the policeman represents the law, your friend, you know, or somebody who's trying to make money, like every situation, you need to relearn this. There's no one rule for this. So it made sense to us that this might be a way to approach it. So this is how Karatani divides this, which pretty much has the added bonus of combining very different branches, so anthropology, sociology, Marxist political economy, into one single approach. So the first, he calls it by letter, so mode A, B, and C, because he doesn't want you to associate too strictly with the way that this appears in one particular situation. So it's true that gift economies, small societies based on gift economy, you will find this with a specific way, but you don't want to fetishize it and say that therefore that's how it happens everywhere. Totem, everyone is totemic, or everyone is an animist. So he gives it just a general abstract name. But basically what you have is the logic of affinity, the logic of reciprocity, the logic of gift giving. It concerns the rules that communities create. It also includes, it's a negative form, which is the relation of communities, which is usually called in anthropology an unbalanced reciprocity or negative reciprocity, right? Which is, for example, war, sacrifice, things like this. There has a destructive side as well. The second mode is the mode based on property, which for him, you see, it's a totally separate logic. It has to do with enclosure of land. It has to do with establishing contracts. It has to do with the possibility of alienating something to someone else. It doesn't really deal with communitarian rules. It deals with law. which usually range over many communities, right? And it also has an unstable or negative version, which is revolution, when you not simply act within the law, but you want to challenge the very legitimacy of the law. So examples are contracts, social pacts, juridical institutions, or corporations, and things like this. They have a different logic. It's not just the logic of affinity, kinship, or something like this. And the third is the classic logic of value. The basic form of it is commodity exchange. It doesn't really work in rules or work in law. It works with tendencies. It's weird, like you can't really describe the law of value. It's something that works one way, then it changes a bit, so on and so forth. And it also has an unstable form, which is still inside of it, which is just crisis. These days, more than defining what happens in many places as being a mixture of affinity, property, and value, it seems as much better to say it's perpetual war, revolution, and crisis all at the same time. But that's still describing the same thing. And what our group did, because as I said, we're interested from the beginning on giving a structural account of things, right? What we did is that we realized that there is one theory that we could use to name these three things as if they come from the same thing. So you still keep them separate, but it facilitates thinking how they can be brought together, which is that we realize that each one of these logics can be structured at a different type of logical structure. Actually, pretty much the three logical structures we know that Aristotle divided for us there with the principle of non-contradiction, the excluded middle, right? And then you can suspend each one of them and you get a different thing. So if you suspend the principle of non-contradiction, you get to have contradictions. You can have something which is true and false at the same time, right? It's called paraconsistent logic. We realized that if you look at paraconsistent logic and if you deal with it in a very specific way, which is not so canonical right now, but if you deal with that in that way, it pretty much allows you to recover most of the crucial concepts from structural anthropology and the way that affinity groups, families, kinship is organized. So to give just a stupid example, for example, if you give me a gift and then I go and buy exactly the same gift and give it back to you, I hate you profoundly, or even worse, I don't even want to connect with you, which is much worse than having an enemy, is having somebody who totally is indifferent to you, right? That's the worst thing. Why? Because it's not even inside the logic. You just want to make it work, to be socially effective as a reciprocal relation, there must be a weird imbalance. And you can think of that imbalance in terms of this strange contradiction. So for example, a gift is only appropriate if it is inappropriate in a certain sense, right? In the same way that, for example, you gave something to me, but whatever I do to that thing, which is now in my possession, has something to do with you. Like if I throw away my grandma's gift to me, it's like I'm killing my grandma who died, this thing. So why is the person who is outside inside the thing that is with me? And we realize that this is totally different than how property works. Property is very classical, right? Property is all about the fact that you can take something and alienate it, remove it, and it has no connection with what's left behind. Once it's your property, it has nothing to do with me anymore. Another example is once a contract is settled, either it obtains or it doesn't obtain. Either it was settled or it wasn't. There isn't this contract is more or less valid. No, either it is or it isn't. There is no half measure, right? Either somebody was elected or they weren't elected. So the very basis of what we call mode B, you have classical social exchange. And weirdly enough, if you suspend the excluded middle rule and you get what is called an intuitionistic logic, which simplifying to the most, you get kind of a gradient between truth and falsity. You can have more or less true, right? You are able to get very far with reconstructing the logic of value. And I mean, you don't even need to go into the pedantic Marxist stuff. You just think about the idea of bargain, for example, where the actual boundary of what's the optimal point of exchange between two things so that they are equivalent is actually up for grabs. Every boundary can kind of be opened up and turned into a place for further bargain. So if you work and your work is based on hours, so the unit is hours, and it's profitable to think about it in minutes, we're just going to change the resolution and exploit the little difference there. Why did you work 10 minutes fast? That 10 minutes is being extracted from the boundary between 1 hour and another. Intensification can be thought in that way. So it was pretty crazy to find out that something so found as a difference between affinity, property, and value can be modeled with the difference between three logical systems. It made some sense because it's hard to think about any other logic, and it's also very hard to think about any other social form of exchange. So perhaps these things are connected somehow. So for us, this was interesting because it served as the basis to start thinking about what does it mean when we talk about the simple context I was talking about. And now we can talk about that simple logical context as being composed of these three things, and that they need to cohere in terms of how they use these three logics with one another, right? So this is what we call a multi-layered, because it has many layers. It's very crappy name, actually. Multi-layered social world. The way that these three logics are combined in every context so that it counts as a social context, right? So you need the three of them. They might be very neatly combined. They might be very confusingly combined, but you need the three of them, and you need to make it so that they cohere with other situations that also has the three of them at stake. And we can actually say, we recuperate something classic from world systems theory by saying, well, the dominant logic, meaning the logic from which standpoint you can see the most differences that make a difference, right? Depending on which dominant logic it is, you get one of the three big world systems that we study. So a mode A, social world, which still has the other two, but if you want to see what's going on, you need to focus on affinity. You won't understand why people hate it. I just exchanged the gift with you. It was the same value. Why do you hate me? Well, you're not looking at it from the right perspective. That situation is dominated by affinity, right? So societies where mode A is the dominant one, you get mini world systems. Societies where mode B is dominant, you get world empires. In societies where mode C is dominant, you get world economies. With the benefit that now we have a grammar that allows us to still make ridiculously huge differences between these three things. Because we need to see exactly how these different logics are being kind of built up in each of these cases. You don't need to coarse grain everything, right? And in this context, now we have a definition for specific social reality. We can say social atoms are the minimal logical units of our daily practices that abide to these three modes of exchange or intercourse, right? It can vary highly. So for example, here we're not exchanging money. You guys didn't come here and pay me directly to do this. So it looks like this is ruled by something else than commodity exchange directly. But we know that even though this might not be ruled by commodity exchange, it's stitched to the rest of the world through financiation of stuff and all types of commitments, right? So you start, this is why I think this is good. You can see that even though this is ridiculously abstract stuff, it's not meant to give you like a one-liner that explains everything. It's meant to give you more words to pay more attention to how things are organized, not less attention. Sometimes we think just because something is abstract, you're gonna just have a one-fits-all solution to everything. But what we need is the contrary. The places are so different that you actually need more words to be able to both identify the differences and the similarities between them. And this comes now to the, I think, the turning point of the discussion, which is, well, I said that every kind of, let me see if I have my little, yes. Every social atom has these three logics and they're mixed together, right? But there are two basic ways in which this can happen. This can happen in what I call the aligned way, which means when for example, when you find out what I mean to you in terms of affinity, you also find out what I mean in terms of property or contracts and in terms of economy. Like these three things map. In a classic modern society of work, work maps three things at once. It's an aligned atom. If you work, you are a citizen. If you're a citizen, you're also a consumer who buys commodities, right? And have some family. So that kind of aligns. If you tell me like, yeah, I'm a provider at my home, that also means you probably have like a formal employment, and that also means you're recognized by the state. These days, there are like 10 people in the world. We still are like that, but that's kind of this model. It weirdly creates a facilitation of connecting things, because if atoms are so neatly organized, it's much easier to connect this to the next, because it's like, if I connect one layer, I connected every layer. For example, if I connect with you at a level of affinity, but then I break the law, you no longer want to be my friend because don't associate with criminals or something, right? So you can see it's homogeneous. It facilitates this happening. The thing on the side is what I call misaligned atom, which is the case where each layer is different. So for example, at the level of capital, only the male person in the family exists. They only care for his direct labor, but invisibly, there's a whole family of people working for the price of labor power to remain so low, a lot of unpaid domestic labor. That part of labor doesn't exist for capital, it doesn't care about it. So there is, at the level of affinity, a sexual division of labor that is hidden below that. It might be maintained by the state, if there is some sort of law to keep people separate in that way, gender division of things, but it might not. It might just be direct coercion through the logic of community, right? But you start getting a weird kind of, how do you call it, like a tilted cake, like a very ugly cake tilted to the side like this, and things don't map to the same thing. The crucial thing about this, so you see, we're already starting to get into a terrain that anyone who doesn't live in Germany knows, and if you don't live in the center of a town, you already know, right? That things are really messy, but they're very logical. And not only they're very logical, but this is the general form. And this aligned case is the special case. So this is not a degeneration of the aligned case. The aligned case is a special condition of this regular, much more easy to work with situation. The misaligned situation makes it easier to connect parts together. And I mean, for example, holy shit. What was the picture that's all? Holy shit, that's heavy. Are you okay? Yeah, I forgot. No, okay, I recall what I was saying. Are you okay? Okay. For example, if you need to extract things from the land, things that are beneath the ground are not commodities. They were not produced through commodity production. So you need to do what Polanyi called fictive commodity, where you first enclose them in the property thing, and then you turn them into commodities. That's a logical reason we can deduce that places close to extractivist regions will have more misaligned atoms, because you need to first work one thing before you work with another. Places where you have overexploitation, again, labor is not born as a commodity, so it's hard to fit it into that form. Places where your absolute surplus extraction is still the main form of surplus extraction will probably require very complicated communitarian systems to make that thing work. So again, where you have like a strong extractivist at the level of labor, you also will get misalignment. So we can actually derive the connection between what happens in the peripheries in the sense of world systems theory and our logical theory. They actually match, right? You can make the prediction that where you have more resources being extracted from outside the commodity world, from its peripheries, if you will, right? You will get more misaligned atoms. Not only that, but you can see that they are easier to connect because they are polymorphous, right? And they are logically the general form. The tendency is that the general case is things are not aligned. And when they do align, that's a special thing, right? I'm going to go quick over this just so we don't lose too much time. But what the nice thing is that we can also show that if you focus specifically, no longer on just this general description of practices, but if you focus, for example, on the constitution of social space, and if you focus on what counts as social time, the fact that we're worried about how things are bound together, and the fact that we're talking about different logics of binding things together, you can derive a lot of our understanding from Henri Lefebvre and all these guys about how social space is constituted. And we can recognize, for example, that the social space where affinity rules, like households, parks, or places where it's kept this communitarian domination, the rule that binds, for example, walls between places. The wall belongs to both the place that's outside and the inside. You have a lot of communal areas that belong to the household and the public space, which is not even public in the classic, again, state-like way of this is private, this is public, there's nothing in between the two, which is a classic distinction, right? You can already see why it's very hard to transform communitarian spaces into public spaces, because something which belongs to both the inside and outside is different from a logic that only sees the inside or the outside, right? So you can actually recuperate these ideas both for space and see that there are different ways that space can be bound together, So for example, the theory of abstract space that Lefebvre works, you can actually generalize it also. Communitarian spaces are abstract spaces as well. You know, modern Europeans don't have the monopoly on abstraction. Everyone knows how to do this. Value spaces are also abstract spaces, but in different ways. And the same is valid for time. So, I mean, I'm going to go quickly over this because it's not what's crucial for us. The same is valid for time, but just before I go to that issue, I just wanted to show something, which is we can then recuperate the division between center and periphery in spatial terms through our logic. So we can say places where atoms are mostly aligned, that's what we call a central place. And it doesn't need to be so geographically clear, because now we have the means to say, you know, you can get out of some countries and you get peripheries, but then inside every place you have, again, a bump of alignment, and that's usually a metropole, a center, right, for the elites and so on. And again, you get peripheries, and you can also get peripheries in the center, in the suburbs of cities and things like this. So you now have a logical way of talking about this. You don't need to simply tie it directly to geography or some of these general markers about labor and land, which not often directly remark with or connect with what's going on. So yeah, this is just a weird, I don't know why I did this. It doesn't clarify anything, but anyway, I did it. I'm going to skip over the issue of time, which is very similar to the issue of space. It's very nice, especially for people interested in psychoanalysis or analysis we do comparing you know, modern history to other forms. Usually people do that distinction between circular and linear time. I think we can substitute that for something much better when we realize that what you're doing is just talking about, you have moments in time and they can have paraconsistent connections, which means if you have a past time and a present time, the boundary between the two might be in the present, meaning you're up to decide what the past event meant, right? Like what your fathers decided for you, you're gonna say what the decision means now, right? So you get these weird common points between disjunct parts. And you can reconstruct much more complex logics of the time of communities that is not just saying that everyone lives in a circular time where the future doesn't exist. You can have like an infinite variation. For that's much closer to how psychoanalysis approaches time, for example. But you can see that the logic of time for state is also very different. For the state is either now or later, before or after, right? Either an election has happened or it didn't, and you kind of create time for the state by creating calendars with dates that say this happened, and all these dates divide this line into two neat segments. You don't have a calendar that says something kind of started here, but I'm not sure, and then it kind of ended there, but might still be going on. That's also why politics and the state go so poorly together, because we're never sure if we're still doing something political or if it ended, right? And especially these days. So we can't really divide the time of politics has ended or still going on by looking at calendars. So you can, again, see this very important way of connecting communities and states through calendars and so on. And the temporality in mode C, again, follows this more intuitionistic account. I didn't talk about the space there, but it's the same principle I mentioned before. In between two moments, you can always take the boundary and kind of spread it and still further differentiate it, right? There's some really interesting things about this. For example, in the actual mathematical logic behind this, you see that the logic of mode A is the logic of mode C, but inverted. It's called a dual category, in fact, a dual topos. But it has a bunch of interesting consequences, but we're not going to nerd out that much today. But what I wanted to get to is to this other thing here, which is actually the core of it all, which is, remember when we gave the general principles of the presentation, we said, yeah, you know, when you connect things as they go on, that's a regional connection. It's not a global thing. You don't get a world. To get a world, a social world, you need to connect whatever may happen in a certain way. So it's a jump to infinity, so to speak, right? For us, history doesn't have anything to do with time directly. History is a problem of this jump at infinity, right? So if you want to understand how we experience history in a given social world and how that changes, you shouldn't look how is time passing, what is happening as time passes. You should look at what is the logic of how this world gets closed, and how does it, so there, in other words, what do things need to be so that they can be integrated into this world, right? So we call world closure. So this kind of, it's a specific term for how can you produce something and then tell if it falls inside the same system produced it. We call world closure the structure of these limits, right? So as you decompose it down, for example, do you get outside of a social world, or do anything that you split into parts remain in your world? For example, these days, I'd say subatomic particles are part of capitalism very much. You can profit by trying to come up with cold fusion, but capitalism hasn't really arrived at a Planck scale. As for now, it's still meaningless in value terms. Value doesn't see it. It's not a difference for it, right? And upwards, we go perhaps to the solar system, I guess. Elon Musk is trying to, at least. But much more than that is meaningless to our social world, right? So there are limits, closures to this. So we want to know how these closures are affected by these different logics we were talking about. So another cool thing we realized is that, well, if you look at the formal stuff, the closure of paraconsistent systems, it has a very nice property, which is it is locally inconsistent, meaning you can have those situations where something is and is not, right? Something is inside, but it's actually outside, or two propositions that they're both true and false, something like that. But it's globally complete. I'm not going to have time to explain this in detail. We can talk about it later. But that nice idea that upward speaking, kind of everything fits, and downward, you can get things that put everything into question. So for example, globally, you kind of can talk about a totality. You can talk about, what we all have in common, and that is a consistent thing to do. But if one stranger appears, suddenly nobody knows anymore what they're doing, and everything can go to hell, right? So otherness, this thing which is not properly coded, can appear from below, so to speak. Interestingly enough, this is a very basic property of what we call the cosmos, this idea that there's some sort of world closure at the level of, everything that is part of our space, right? Which goes along in many societies where mode A dominates with the threat of one person appears, one strange encounter in a forest, and suddenly you're not sure if you're human anymore, which is something Amerindian perspectivism talks a lot. So weirdly enough, inconsistency, this kind of openness is at the lower level, it's the bottom, right? It's the same thing for us moderns. It's generally like this. We know everything about everything except about our neighbor, right? That person is really threatening. So that's pretty much the same thing with all the different mediations to differentiate the two things. But classical systems, or worlds dominated by mode B, they tend to have the same problems that classical logical systems have. It's very hard for them to be consistent and complete. The whole Godel stuff. So you get two things. Either you get small systems that are very hierarchically built so that you can kind of control what happens at every layer, make sure there's no inconsistency, but then they're always restricted, very weak. Or you need to get many of those, one build after the other with a new constructive layer on top of it. So it's a very, very much hierarchical idea of history, which is very much kind of the way that you see in very, very different societies and appearing in very, very different ways. But this strange stratification of dynasties, seasons, eras, so on, very hierarchically built. Historians are pretty much tasked with making sure this consists and you can actually account for what happened and so on. But in that periodization, you actually get consistent experience of history, which is neither the mode A history of a cosmos and not the modern one as well. It usually gets lost. In fact, we always bring these two together as if there's only that. Either you're in a modern, progressive, looking forward type of stuff, or you're in a circular world. So most of history is neither of the two. And finally, mode C, we again get a nice coincidence, which is intuitionistic logic gives you a system that is locally consistent and globally incomplete. And that's pretty much how our history works, capitalist countries. Locally, you can come up with a quark, and then you can ask, but how much does it cost? So anything you can throw at us locally, we can ask the price of it, and it will fit somehow. But globally, otherness is always a problem. So there's always the future, there's always a crisis, there is also the other, but it's always the national other or the state other. Something always is actually at a higher scale that the otherness or the problem appears, right? So it's even clearer that what I meant by one thing being invert of the other, right? Mode A and mode C, they look like the inverse, and even nicely, both of them contain the logic of the state. Because if the logic of the state is binary, and both of them have both the binary plus something else, no wonder that the state is the best thing to mediate between these two things. Logically speaking, if you want to stitch together communities and capital, what they both have in common is that they have truth and false, inside and outside. So if you focus on that, if you make it smaller, it's easier to connect parts. So in our theory, the state is smaller than a community. It's smaller than the logical value. That's why it's so ubiquitous. So for us, ultimately, history is not a matter of time. History has to do with this logic. So you get different kind of senses of history depending on how these things are built up, right? And the crucial thing is that we can now define what peripherization is. She arrived exactly at the right moment. We're defining the title of the talk. I'm sorry to highlight you, just this funny. We can define exactly what peripherization is by looking at disclosure and using the concepts we developed thus far. So focusing only in capitalist societies, what we bring back now is that idea of alignment and misalignment I mentioned. So atoms can be like really, really like a nice cake, or they can be the other type. And you can say modernization is the case where, to guarantee that capitalist social world remains consistent, you need to add more aligned stuff to stitch together this context. So modernization is when everything new should take the form of aligned stuff, or most aligned stuff, and that will allow us to continue to stitch together a common world. Peripherization is the case where you need to produce more misaligned stuff to be able to match things together. So times of extreme colonization or extractivism, where you want to bring things into the capitalist system that are below the land, you know, within our own kind of living makeup, tend to need to produce more peripheral social atoms, so to speak. And it's nice because you can actually tell these things apart in a nice, simple way. Ultimately, there is a very nice equivalence between what we're calling differences or context and constraints or norms. Those two things have a tight connection. So for example, if you think about, you know, the difference between moments in time where if you're raising a kid, you can give very few advices about how to lead your life, and it works. They already know how to behave in many, many situations. Because atoms are aligned. If I tell you to respect others, that already includes your relationship to the police, to your boss, to everything. It's just one advice and you get everything covered. But if you know you live in Rio, you have to say to people, respect others, but with the police, you shouldn't talk to them. But then again, you should pretend like you are. And in that other situation, you need to kind of not really follow what your boss said. So you need to give many different advices because the situation is totally fragmented and heterogeneous. So what you're seeing there is how you pass along misaligned constraints. You need to literally explicitate them all separately. You cannot just talk about the combined version of them. So peripherization is at the same time increase in heterogeneity in social space, social conflicts, social fracturing, disintegration of a kind of common space, but it's also the coming to the fore of the logics that actually constitute these things. There is a more fetishistic kind of narrow mentality where you think these things are always aligned because that's just the same principle that comes from our human essence or comes from the conquests of, you know, civil movements, and then you think you want all those things at once, and you get very scared when you start losing them, or they don't work exactly that way again, and you think our social institutions are disintegrating, and you know, we're just going back to barbarism. It's not. It's absolute capitalist modernity. It just works like that in most places. Just didn't work in your little corner. So peripherization then has nothing to do with dismantling or disordering, right? It is actually the general form, and the modern case is the special case of peripherization. If anything, it's a weird inversion of classic thesis of dependence theory, where the idea is that at best you have like a kind of stable connection between underdeveloped and developed countries. Of course, there is regional exploitation, geopolitical power, but if you want to talk about the movement of forms, you're always talking about the center expanding towards the periphery, like imperialism, for example. You're being Americanized. But in the last couple of decades, nobody talks about Americanization anymore. They talk about Brazilianization, Lebanization, Ukrainization, because peripheral forms are the ones that are actually getting generalized. And progressives in central countries, they sound conservative because they're afraid of losing what they have as the periphery expands. So it's weird. You get a progressive reactionarism, right? Like, oh my God, we had everything. Now we're losing. But the thing they're losing, people in other places of the world don't really care about it because they never had it. And if you want to see the future these days, you should look at the peripheries. I think Ballard said that, right? It's a very good quip. Yeah, I'm just going to skip this recapitulation. And just to close, so you see, like, this general approach to things, it kind of preserves from world systems theory a bunch of concepts, right? We managed to talk about center, periphery. We managed to distinguish between world systems. We're not trapped in talking about value form, and everything else is pre-abstract, pre-fetishistic logics. No, everything has the same logic. We still keep from value form the idea of real abstraction. We're not too much focused on the terms, the particulars. We can still realize that, well, you can change the people, but the dynamics remain, right? And we actually, I didn't explore this with you guys now, but you can actually show that with the same exact material that we are using here, so the same idea of atom, logic, blah, 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 we can talk about political organization. It's also about stitching together small things where some differences make a difference, some don't make a difference, seeing how you can make these things cohere into larger structures. So we can get an equally structural view of what it means to produce emancipation, right? There are other details to that. I'm not going to talk about them right now, but so you still keep that idea from the third quadrant that there is something useful about mediations, right? So you've kind of managed to bring these three things together somehow. That's why we're excited about this. It seems to contribute with something to the debate. And it leads very nicely to more immediately prescriptive discussions. Okay, what does it mean to organize in peripheral conditions? Well, the first thing, it means to recognize you're in a very uneven terrain, and the way that things will connect, that will be efficacious, will probably have nothing to do with coming up with norms that are meant to be valid at all these levels at once. So it's funny because, you know, if you read, I don't know, the Communist Manifesto, in the section about what communists do, Marx had this idea, which is actually a second order idea, right? So the actual narrative you can see strategically is society of work is going to politicize people almost homogeneously because work homogenizes, puts us in uniforms, gives us the same type of sufferings, we complain about the same things. So we're going to organize. We're going to organize in different contexts. Those are the proletarian parties, and then communists are the most advanced sectors of every proletarian party, and that's what gives it an international kind of compositional task that comes at the end. What you can see now is that you actually need the inverse. There is no common experience. It's very hard to generalize anything, and you actually need to build tools to be able to do any generalization. So in a certain sense, you need to build something common before politicization, because otherwise people don't even experience their suffering in similar ways. We can actually have a theory with this basic stuff of why narratives of suffering today, they don't match. They're not, formally speaking, they're not typed similarly. So what makes a difference in different contexts changes. You can account for crises on the left through this way, because the way we don't manage to talk has a lot to do with the fact that the social systems are themselves fractured. So if you tend to engage more with the level of value, with strikes, with correlation of forces. I mean, I can actually, I have appendixes to this presentation, sorry, in case certain issues appear. If you look at this middle crazy thing here, you see like there's the logic C here, the logic A here, and the logic B, right? If you look at, here this is what we call just political organization. But if you look at this, the way that most strategic logics work for politics, they also match this logic. So if you focus on changing communitarian relations, your tendency is that you have a paraconsistent strategy. You tend to think in terms of dual power, for example, where you're out, like think of Black Panthers, for example, building a nation inside a nation. You're going to have something which is outside of the system, but is inside of the system. And people who are focused on institutional politics, which is more classical, we're going to say you're crazy, like, oh, there's no such thing, you're just a palliative thing. And you're going to think they are reformists who only believe politics happens when you take power in a kind of classical way, right? And don't realize that you can take power, but there's still continuity with the previous thing. So you can start being able to make a typology of our problems in the left, because they also have pretty much, they also follow from this weird logical impasse. Of course, not everything follows from this, but it makes it much easier to compose political organizations when you know you're trying to kind of bridge and port together things that have equally heterogeneous structures, right? So it does serve as a kind of basis for a theory of organization, which is what we're actually interested in. I think I spoke for very long. Yeah, but thank you so much, guys. And I apologize, I totally did something wrong.
Thanks a lot, Gabriel. Now we have some space for Q&A. Maybe if you have any question, you can raise your hand so I can see you for the microphone.
It's me. But so, I mean, no, I probably kind of sound like, you know, I'm a structuralist and, you know, I'm coming out as a structuralist here, but it's very interesting what you, that in a sense you're going back to kind of the classical problems of structural dialectics, right? But you're employing, you know, this account of logic in a way that seems to, how do you say, kind of bypass or go around, you know, the major question that's occupied whatever kind of leftist theory, let's say, since whatever structuralism, about, you know, what is the subject of politics, what is, so I mean, what I find intriguing about this, and of course you present, this is an immense amount of work and it requires a lot of time to work through, and you know, one would do that before having further engagements, but just as a comment in a sense that, so what is it that you know, that it seems that there's no, so the whatever we would talk about the subject before would be here, what, the political organization in a certain way, right? Or this would be the way that one would kind of think about the position of that in the schema that you're drawing out, right? Because it seems like the same principles. I mean, so the idea that, you know, that there's no history but the history of structure, the idea that also, I mean, I guess, but also here I have the question about the employment of this kind of the transcendental point in this, right? I mean, if you could comment a bit on this. This is from Karatani. Maybe Badiou as well.
Yeah, as well,
I mean, obviously. But so yeah, I mean, I don't know how that link. It somehow links, but I can't work it out now.
Yeah,
but it links to the question of this. Yeah, sorry.
I mean, Levi-Strauss used to say, right? I mean, he said it once or twice that he had a theory of the transcendental without a subject. Forget now where he says. I think it's the Paul de Man accused him of this, and Paul Ricoeur probably, right? Accused him of this, and he liked it. Like, I have a Kantism without a subject. So I mean, there is actually a weird connection with Badiou and his own approach, because both kind of say that that's what they're doing. Okay, but I didn't go into this, but for us, the way that this is solved is that I don't think that, honestly, I think that this is why we like Badiou and we use a lot of his work, because it's very hard to find any political philosopher in the last, I don't know how old, perhaps since Hegel, that thinks that the subject is the collective part, is not this weird point of impasse that is escaping collectivity, and it's like the asocial part, you know. If you're the annoying person in the group, you're the one that's the most desiring subject. Like, that cannot be the case in politics, you know? So there are resources, though I don't think he's very good at presenting this. I think he doesn't make the best case for it. But pretty much his theory of politics is that if you take the collection of connections between things, that's the subject, not you as part of it. You're an individual, you have your own concerns. They might be totally stupid, but taken as this reorganization of stuff, right? That reorganization is what you would call a subject. So if you ask who is thinking in politics, you shouldn't go back to individuals. You should look what people are doing collectively, which is often different from what they're doing individually. A lot of people in movements are just concerned with, you know, meeting people and hooking up. That doesn't get in the way. I mean, while they're trying to hook up, they're protesting and stuff. And the protest is the important part, not what they're doing. So you need to change the scale of analysis and look at the differences that make a difference in the context of interest. Since psychoanalysis and a lot of political philosophy doesn't care for this type of differentiation, you either have a subject always in the same place or you don't have one at all. So it's either language or the body but you can't really check it relative to the meaningful context. So I think that the only theory we could find that had the formal resources to talk about politically organizing as something which is part of a subjective process. It thinks something. And we can know what it thinks. It thinks how to connect social parts in such a way that you cannot explain that connection without bringing up political principles. So you can have like a normative theory of politics. When you're doing something and I ask, why are you doing it? And in the game of giving and asking for reasons, you say, because somebody gave me a gift, I need to give it back. Or, this is what my mother wants me to do. Or even like I'm, a great individual, that's what I'm doing it. Or I need to do it for my job, the mode C explanation. Or I need to do it because the law tells me to. There's no politics involved. Usually there's politics when you give an account of your reasons and they make no social sense. Like they make sense to your friends, they make sense to your comrades, but like your parents say like, this is not a good reason. Like you're gonna fuck your life up. Or your friends say like, why are you not going out with us right now and doing this thing? Or how does this stupid thing you're doing connect to this bigger thing? So connecting things under normative principles that are not general, in a certain sense, they're not logical, that's politics. So you can give a logical definition of it as well, which is very plastic, right? It doesn't have any content. So for us, if you want to listen even more specifically to what it means to listen to political subjectivity, it means to listen to people's reasons for doing things socially that are not common reasons. When you take those things seriously, right, you're looking at principles that precisely because they're not just these regular tree logics, they can stitch parts of the world together under non-trivial principles. So people who are not in the same family might be meeting all the time. They're not in the same part of town. They're not from the same class. And this gives you a concrete way to evaluate if politics is happening, regardless of what people are saying, which I think is the most important part. A consequence in situations, and I think this is one of the first principles we see today, is that, Marx actually wrote about this very nicely in the German ideology, that times of social disintegration, usually political thinking becomes very phraseological, meaning it's all about the discourse, because you can't tell what's below. A word means different things in different places, so let's just focus on the word and worry about the places, right? So what happens in this situation is that you cannot really trust discourse, political discourse. It can mean anything. One person is really engaged in a struggle, the other is using the same words, but they're like at their house just playing video game, and you can't tell. So you shouldn't trust it. You need to listen to something else, right? So this way of talking about things, like listen to how reasons allow people to connect parts of their worlds in ways that are non-trivial, meaning they're not reducible to any of these three logics in some way. That gives you a non-discursive, in that particular sense, theory of political thinking, right? So that's where we think this can go, and it already is very helpful in many situations. It's also good in a situation where parties are disintegrated. You don't know if Communist Party is even on the left anymore. You don't know if, I don't know, how do you call this? Like, in neighborhoods, you have like neighborhood associations, right? They're meant to just manage stupid stuff. They might be more political than your party. So you need to have some criteria to investigate this. A women's group just for mutual aid might be much more political than the big communist meeting to discuss Marxist books and so on. So how do you tell those things apart? You tell them apart because they are bringing up norms to do things that you can't simply generalize. You can only, let's say, you need to build your own justification as you go along, right? It's very experimental in a way. And in cases, it will include party politics as well. There are places where political parties are very much doing that as well. So it's not, let's say, anti-party politics. It's not against any type of politics. It's kind of an orthogonal principle. So for us, it's a theory of subjectivity that is strictly political. It's not meant to be generalized to everything. It has resonances with Badiou, but it's not his own theory. For example, Badiou doesn't spend a long time talking about how you connect parts of a subjective process. He does have a full fleshed out theory of this, but in the conceptual books, he never takes time discussing this. Like if you read Being an Event, there's most of the discussion on subject is about connecting a bit to another bit of conditions, to ranks, to information you extract from a generic filter or whatever, but nobody knows how to name those ideas politically. You just say you're faithful to an event, and there it is, right? I just one other remark on this, which is good, is that one thing we can do with this is that you can be a bit more distrustful as well of events in a certain sense. Because, for example, imagine a situation where, I don't know, the thing is worked out in some way that communitarian concerns are very low, very invisible. They don't count very much. And we organize to make them count. But what you're now bringing up is just the communitarian structure as it already was. And in that sense, it is a relative event. It's relative to the other logics, but it's totally typified previously. What will emerge in this way is just more of the same. For example, a fight to get into the marketplace as a formal employer, formally employed person. It might be new relative to that situation because it hasn't happened yet in that place. But once it does happen, it's not going to bring anything new because it's new with regards to one logic. It's not new with regards to the three logic. So it makes our tasks even more complicated because you have now a relative theory of events. You can have ruptures in one layer that are not ruptures at all in other layers, right? So you can distinguish, for example, feminist movement from liberal feminism, which just seeks to codify the inclusion of women in the marketplace, doesn't care of bringing anything new that requires political work to become a justification in the world. So you can make that distinction a bit clearer as well. Yeah, so. Yeah. Can occupy any. There isn't a formalization. No, there's no. I can't predict the best politics. That's called justice. Yeah, exactly. The idea is this. Like that's why it's politics and not social life. Politics, you need ideas. You don't need transcendental point of views, right? You have an idea to solve problems that have to do with material conditions. Those ideas are not reducible to just reproducing a single logic. They will probably tell you how to stitch the logics in that situation in such a way that something new can appear. But you can make that distinction more strictly between the actual social logic of situations, which has all this complexity to it, but politics proper won't be reducible to any of these things. And the nice thing is a double thing that this crazy diagram here we showed with the three logics here, this is an open problem today. Nobody knows in mathematics how to totally connect paraconsistent, classical, and intuitionistic logic, how they stitch together in a single formal system. There's no clear idea of that. And the second good thing is that the same formal stuff we're using, it makes a very good distinction between mathematics and logic. So formalizing is not the same thing as giving a logic. You can have formal structures that don't have clear logic. They are messy. So it's actually much bigger than just clear logical structures. Actually, might explain why these things have a logical structure. Probably they have a logical structure because that's economic. If we're all organizing, we're very good logicians, in fact, we don't know this, but if you're always organizing with these minimal logical structures, it's very easy to make sure things cohere, right? If they were changing all the time, it would be harder. So that's also a good thing. Peripheral situations would train a lot in changing these things. So probably organizational know-how for the future is going to come from here. It's not going to come from, Ivy League universities. So yeah, there is experimental stuff to do to find out what politically works and how we compose things. It's not going to be derived directly from a social logic. So it's good because the weakness of the system matches the weakness of the thing we want to overcome, right? Hopefully, it has something to do with that. But yes, I also felt like we should find a fourth thing and just solve it, but I don't think there's... Probably we can predict that only after revolution will mathematicians solve that one. If social being determines social consciousness.
I'm just gonna turn on the.
Yeah.
If you have any more questions, maybe you can raise your hand.
Hey, thanks for this talk. It was great. My question was, I think, related to Nadia's. My question was about the stitching. I mean, I don't know if I can call it kind of like a metaphor, you know, you're using the word stitching together. It seems like there's something more that needs to be said about what is the stitching that is being done. It seems to me that the logics, that the three logics are still somehow separate, right? The kind of, I wasn't able to imagine like, what do you think about the kind of relation between the logics? How these logics kind of determine each other, right? Like, I mean, affinity, let's say. I mean, affinity might is, well, not the same in pre-capitalist society than in capitalist society, right? So kind of these logics, as you mentioned, are kind of, there's an interplay between these logics, but kind of I can't look at them as completely separate and then say this one is dominant here, and then I should only look at affinity and then disregard property or value. Because what if, I mean, affinity is no longer just affinity in this context. And then my second question is, so this kind of systems is only descriptive of the world, right? Like does it give any prescriptive discourse on what to do? I mean, as Nadia was saying, I mean, where to intervene, and at which logic do I intervene in order to interrupt kind of the logic that is happening, or is this where this is going? Kind of these are my two questions.
Sorry, what's your name?
Abdullah.
Okay, you know, I made it much simpler today just because I had to rush with this stuff. And I mean, I don't honestly, I mean, the formal stuff behind this is something called sheaf theory, which I totally don't master at all. Like I'm borderline fraud on it, but I have friends. I know a guy who's good at it. No, but we work with it collectively and so on. But so I mean, you can use the same author Badiou to give a bit more of a definition. For example, you could talk about stitching, formally talking about it in terms of your capacity to localize. I think I've been removed from the meeting. Okay. You can talk about the possibility of going back to those contexts, right? Something like one context needs to be able to localize the other, meaning you need to have resources to map something else inside what you're doing. That's one condition. Then when you localize in both sides, you make the two things compatible. So for example, if only us can talk about the talk outside the room, but outside of the room, we cannot talk about what's going on here, they're not in the same world. You need to both be able to situate one part in the other, but do it in both ways. And then this allows you to order parts. And then you get a logical mereology out of it, so to speak. Sheaf theory is just a big kind of set of formal tools to stitch together parts of data into complex databases that are fibered and so on. It's very sophisticated stuff. You can get a lot of nice ideas. They're more specific, but I think your question was just not about that. It was more specifically about the mixture of the logics, right? So I think there are 2 points there. The first point is that, let's say the analytic part is that, for example, first of all, you're totally right. I just made a schematic distinction, but in practice I mean, you can even tell this, if you're analyzing a situation by only one of these three logics, you're probably not analyzing it socially. So for example, when you talk about commodity exchange, for us, that's a hybrid term. That's not a term from the logic of value. If you're a commodity, like to be like Einstein and be on the standpoint of the light beam, right? If you're on the standpoint of a commodity, there is no such thing as exchange. Commodities don't care. It doesn't make a difference for a commodity that is exchanged, right? What cares is the value, and if it's decomposed or composed into new commodities. To exchange is actually to take commodities, put them in the property logic, and then get alienation at the level of mode B. So it's already a heterogeneous process. That's why it's hard to account for exchange and production. It's not really a pure debate. It's a debate, it's actually a hybrid debate. So it already is a messy thing. It could help us to clear those problems up. Any concrete social context will be a mixture of these things. So, I mean, you're definitely right. One good thing is that we have a building block to talk about that connection, which is not just affinity property and like conceptual stuff. You can talk about these spatial conceptions of gluings and so on. For example, from our standpoint, community building is not Schmittian, was never Schmittian. It's never about inside and outside, enemy and friend. It was always more than that, polyvalent. It always has something excessive. Psychoanalysis didn't invent that inside, outside also has this extimate thing. It's always like that. Most communities have to come up with figures to deal with what's neither here nor there. Everyone does this. It's only French people who, you know, modern societies haven't really dealt with it. Then they need psychoanalysts for that. Another reason why you don't get psychoanalysis everywhere. To the bad thing about my profession. But the good thing is that you can account, for example, for the difference between the nation state and general communities. General communities tend to have these weird disjunctions and conjunctions. The nation state is a community filtered through the state, a binary community, either in or out, right? And it's funny because the two big forms of community building within capital nation state systems is either nation or the people. And it's kind of like you dismember the structure of affinity. You get the inside and out, that's nation, and populism is just the in-between. Everything is neither here nor there. Everyone is everyone, that's the people, right? Just the common, with no recognition of the differences, or you get just the differences with no common ground, that's the nation. So you can start tracking those differences logically and derive them from one theory, rather than have separate theories, and then you need to try to make Laclau fit with Benedict Anderson or something like this. You just derive it, everything from one. So, I mean, somebody would have to do that. We need more people, because just the minutiae of this becomes more singular. For example, we probably could tell apart nation states in places where there's a much more misaligned structure than nation states in places where there's more aligned structure. So we could make that distinction, which is not currently made. Or populism in peripheral countries, different populism in central places. You can start seeing how being surrounded by more aligned logical spaces changes your own structure. So the vocabulary should grow. So it should be richer analytics. So that's the first part. And then the second part of your comment, the prescriptive part. Well, for me, it's prescriptive to say, worry about how you compose together heterogeneous stuff, take these communist concerns, put them to the beginning of your strategy rather than at the end. That's for me prescriptive. And I think it's a good prescription not to think you can do too much strong prescriptions outside of place. The whole concrete analysis of concrete situations was a strategic prescriptive concern. You know, you need to know what in that particular context has any chance of putting into play normative principles that are not reducible to these three logics. So once you know there are more than one logic at play, it's easier to tell if it is reducible or not. For example, a lot of continental political philosophy has simply assumed that if it has a structure of paraconsistency, it is subversive new. For example, if it has a point of impossibility in the real, it's already something great, you know, but all communities are like that. If we just come up with a crazy Nazi community, it's going to be like that because it's always like that, you know? So it's not enough. So you get that added kind of notion. Okay, I'm aware of this. This is not just going to work on its own. You still need to stitch it under non-trivial ways, even if you do need to do community building as well. Another very crucial point, and on this, I think it's a really great book to read by a Brazilian political philosopher called Rodrigo Nunes. He wrote a recent book by verse. It's called Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal, where he gives this account of political strategy today, which is based on the same idea. We actually are, probably I stole a lot of stuff from him. He's a good friend, which is you need a diversity of tactics. In a fractured system, it's impossible that one tactic is going to work because the system is totally fractured. So you need to have many tactics. So you need to know how to tolerate the Trotskyist guy you don't like, right? And the autonomist communist you also don't like, and the policymaker NGO person you also don't like. So they need to, making these things get along is not a secondary problem. It's a central problem. Another thing we can, so thinking strategy in terms of an ecology of strategies becomes part of prescriptive problems. Connecting parts of the social world through social reproduction becomes political problem because society is not going to do it, right? The theory of exploitation that follows from our approach here suggests that capitalism probably will never have to organize people again. You can just organize value. You can organize work without organizing workers. So there's not going to be guaranteed means of social reproduction. If nobody stitches these things together, they're not going to happen. So again, it's a kind of prescriptive thing to look at. But prescription should be something like, it's good to pay attention to this when you're thinking about the stuff you're doing, rather than do this, right? So, I mean, who am I to say what should be done politically here? So I think that's the type of prescription we need. A way of looking at very, very different situations that facilitates composing them once things get going, rather than just building a bit. Then you're not connected to an international political movement, so you start distrusting your own new norms, and then you just fade away because there's no way of continuing, right? So I think there is something prescriptive inside of that somewhere. I'm not sure. Hope it helped.
A very creative and inspiring talk, and I like the general direction you're going with it. But I'm trying to figure out what exactly you status you give logic. So, you know, you could say logic is sort of descriptive. You're using it to describe these different worlds and how they compose, and on that level, it's descriptivist logic. You could say you could be more hardcore about it, like Badiou, and say that this logic has some deep meaning. Actually, is the structure. It's not just describing the structure, but is, you know, logic is a form of ontology with some even metaphysical claims. Or you could say the use of the logics is kind of analogical, like they're metaphorical and they produce interesting new thoughts, but they're not necessarily like an engineering tool or a metaphysical way of describing the world. And what I thought of when you were doing your talk is I actually thought of not Badiou really, but I thought of Carnap. So there was a unity of science movement in the 50s and 40s, and it kind of died out afterwards, which kind of held this hypothesis, which could be simplified in saying that, well, if we have like a logic that can connect all of the sciences, would be then the job of philosophy, then somehow we could reach a superior state of world harmony among all the scientists and rationalism, and this would somehow be a crucial component of socialism, or maybe even would help achieve socialism throughout the world. And it was a fairly powerful movement, but that didn't really work out, is the historical problem for all sorts of various scientific and logical reasons. And, you know, there are many different types of logics. People like myself, we use them as engineering tools. And what ends up that capitalism ended up doing, and most of science ended up doing, is increasingly abandoning a logical perspective. So you still use logic in like physics or computer science or math. When you're making like you want to prove a statement, you have a theorem and you have a proof of the theorem with some assumptions. But what you're seeing, if you said like, let's talk about social atoms with like a capitalist social scientist, let's say, is that they tend to talk about things in terms of statistics. That they say, well, we can, you know, Marx had these kind of large abstractions like classes, but we can delve down on a lower level and really look at the actual individual behavior or the collective behavior and discover emergent properties, so forth and so on. So I was wondering, I mean, kind of how you think about logic, and if you think there is a place for statistics in all of this, which is, you know, probability theory, so forth and so on.
Okay. Yeah, I think, first of all, I mean, just very briefly, I think that it's time to also give a new reading of why Badiou uses these things. I personally have a alternative story to why he uses these things. I think Badiou has a problem similar to the beginning of Capital. Nobody knows how to explain why the first chapter is so, you know, abstract and stuff. And then at the end of the book, you get the primitive accumulation chapters, and you say, so that's the historical origin of capitalism. That's presupposed in the beginning, something like this. I think that being an event is very similar. I don't think you can understand any of his choices at the beginning if you don't know that he's primarily worried with, I need to talk about being or something very broad under 4 assumptions. Because art changes constantly what we think objects are, I cannot think being as an object. Because politics changes what is essential to existence, and we find out new things are essential all the time, I cannot assume being is existence. Because psychoanalysis has shown that unity is not a given, because people are not even born as a unit, they need to become unified. I cannot assume being is one, and because mathematics doesn't necessarily need to make sense in order to think, I cannot assume being is sense. So he's committed to these four things, and I think he would have accepted anything that was able to make rational statements while preserving these four things. It's pragmatic. Find me something else that says rational things that doesn't presuppose objects, existence, sense, or unit, and that will be cool. So it's pragmatic and militant, because first the guy is committed to all these other principles, and then he says, well, if you want to do abstract stuff that has something to do with the common of situations, it won't be able to, it cannot say that much more than this. So I think there's an underlying pragmatic commitment to say, I want to make rational statements that are valid to many situations, but I want it to make in a weak way so that I don't over-determine those situations. So I want to say something like, things have color, but I don't want to say which color they have, right? So he pretty much just want to see what else you can say by starting from the idea that things are multiples, and they're not necessarily, I don't know which object form they have. I don't know if they exist or not. I don't know if they make sense or not. I don't know if what, you know, any of those things. So I think our approach is similar in that, because when you extract the political, and you're not trying to make metaphysics, I just need this to work politically. Two things become possible. The first is that if you ask me, like, where do we take the idea, where did this transcendental stuff appear from? From politics. People have been fighting against segregation for thousands of years. That's how we come up with the idea that affinity logic exists, because you work against it, then it becomes intelligible to you. How do you know property exists? Because you try to do something without property, then you quickly realize what property is. You know, the same with value. The guy who came up with the best theory of value was, you know, directing the Workers' International. So first you have those commitments, then you get a better epistemological point of view for what is, let's say, the basic frame of what we're working. So I think that if any other tool appears that is better than the ones we're using, would be happy to. I do think that the fact that whatever is the case is kind of isomorphic in some level to the stuff I'm talking about, because it's not usual for social sciences or political thinking, because as we said, this should be evaluated ultimately if it is useful for people who are doing things, for us to identify where to do and what to do, and to see if we've done it right. That's the criteria, right? Well, the fact that worrying about this ultimately does coincide, weirdly enough, with things that are going out there, and seems like sensible way of describing them, right? So, for example, it's a weird thing. I think structuralism, for example, even though Lévi-Strauss has those long appendices by André Weil on, you know, group theory and so on, it's like you take one statement from mathematics and nothing much more. Like none of the theorems from the field have anything to say about that social science. Only a little bit of connection you make is like a metaphor. So I don't have a commitment to if this is metaphorical or not. I do think that this question is almost a bit over, like there's an over concern with the status of this sometimes. Like I'm only engaged if you give me a good answer to that question, when I think the pragmatics is already enough to some point. But I think it's good at least, I'm not sure what status we should give it, but it's good at least that you can take much more material. You know, you can first trust more how mathematics actually work. You don't need to pretend it's something it's not. You actually learn things you can bring back to politics out of actual theorems being proved in these fields, you know. But it might be limited. I'm not thus far it has been good, but I'm definitely open for finding out that it's not. I do think that the difference with the kind of Carnap idea is that I think that it's the inverse arrow. I have the impression that the Vienna Circle, broadly construed, had a political idea, but moved to science, and then brought a tool from politics that they were no longer concerned with directly into the scientific and meta-scientific or philosophical milieu. For us, I think we have a very clear difference between what it means to do something and what it means to use something. For example, you can use artistic pieces to do politics, like you compose compose the International, right? And you can use politics to do art, like you take a photo of a protest, it's aesthetically pleasing, but those things are still When you take a photo of a protest, you're not doing politics. You're doing art by using politics, right? For us, we're using science, but we're not doing science. And that means you respect the difference. So you know that to do science, you need to have other commitments. We don't have those commitments. The moment that it's no longer useful, it's fine. We can stop doing it. So I don't think we need to have such a clear philosophical sense of how these things fit, because I think that the idea that making that fit in the proper way has political import is already the problem. That's where I think we disagree with more kind of logicist or you know, metalogical idea that you find in Carnap a bit, that there is something in the very systematicity of science that is rational, and because of that is also conductive to something that has socialist inspiration. We start from politics, we want to go back to politics, and this whole crazy stuff I'm talking to you is just the best in-between term we could find. And I think that this is actually translates very nicely to the fact that, I mean, we're trying to start using more statistical methods. A lot of computational science is very amenable to dialogue with category theory, which is what we're using. I mean, most of the stuff in category theory people use is to prove, you know, is to use like the Curry-Howard equivalence and stuff like that. So it's all about computer science. Ultimately, it's the only way they get funding, actually. So there is a lot of ideas there, and nothing prevents atoms in art theory from being statistical relevant stability things, you know? So, I mean, you can just have like dependent events, that's the synthetic aspect, and statistical fluctuations, that's the analytic aspect. So that would work. Nothing problematic there, even though politically sometimes, you know, if you politicize science too much, you want to not use what capitalists use. We don't care. If it bringing back to politics, it's helpful. So it makes total, I mean, I would definitely like to pursue that more, you know? I'm not sure if I answered. It's good, okay. Just one other thing you said about logic and complexity and stuff. I'm not sure what, I mean, people who are more aware of this and more know more about this could tell me, but I have the impression that this particular approach to complexity, it's just starting to hit off now. It's not, you know, the idea of complexity that was born in complexity theory, where it's all about emergence, it's all about, you know, irreducibility of some computation and so on. And it's not, let's say, dynamic systems, also perturbations, singularity, and so on. It's very much connected to, again, category theory, and a specific mathematician, I will not know how to pronounce her name, Erisman or something. She has a really good book on memory evolutive systems, and they try to propose an idea of complexity, which starts from something they call the multiplicity principle. It's also in theoretical biology these days. This idea that something is complex when it has multiple models that are not total of the system. So you see, it's a different sense of complexity, which is not inherently dynamic, and you're already talking about things are really rich, you cannot reduce them. On the contrary, it's complexity because it's reducible to many non-simulatable models, right? So I like the idea that it's also a different way of approaching complexity from this organizational standpoint. Things are complex, they're irreducible to simple simulatable, blah, 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 but at the same time, it's not, doesn't have that charged substance of, you know, black boxing things, and they're just non-linear and stuff. So it's also more intelligible, I think. But it's the nerdy part of stuff. I need a consultant from them.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. This is wonderful. And I think your answer to this question leads nicely into my question. This is super interdisciplinary. You're touching on all sorts of things. I was wondering if you could maybe just talk a little bit about what it's like to work in your group. Like, what does an average day
well,
look
we can
like
all
when
go
you
there
guys
and
do
find
this?
out. You're all
Yeah. But it's no, I'm fascinated. Like, how does like these sorts of ideas, how are they generated by the sort of social dynamics of who you work with, how you do it?
Sure.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Sorry, what's her name?
Tom.
Yeah, it's very briefly, the subset, it was actually the subset of something, like it's not just such a pedantic name. There was a collective in Brazil whose actual practice was about bringing together different social movements and political parties and anarchists and trade unionists in Brazil, putting them in the same situation. We would talk about different problems we were having in different fronts of struggle and see if there were common issues. Usually the issues were all organizational, like everyone ideologically disagreed, but like organizing a protest, everyone was equally bad. dealing with, sexual misconduct, everyone was equally bad. Racism, everyone was equally bad. Dealing with hierarchy, everything was, when it came to the organizational problems of stitching these things together, we were all in the same boat. Our explanations about it were totally different. And then we developed this subset to try to theorize the practice we had in that collective. That collective lasted for about a decade. It dissolved at the end of the pandemic because we just couldn't do any meaningful work anymore. But the theoretical group continued, and today it's much more international. It's not really just in Brazil. And it's also connected to people with very, very different struggles in different parts of the world. But the funny thing, I mean, I don't, it's terrible, but it's terrible for the most part, and then it's really good because we function like this. Anyone can join, really. We don't have any restriction. The only restriction is you present whatever you're working on that you think has any vague relation to this whole stuff, but it doesn't have to have any direct connection. So people present on, I don't know, Marx's theory of painting. The other person presents on Wilfred Sellers. The other present on, I mean, we have very distinct things. We give a lot of presentations, different people, and then we start doing synthetic presentations on what happened until then. So we try to stitch together the different presentations everyone gave. And those synthetic moments of trying to bring these things together in a coherent way, that's how this appears. But that's why we don't really know where ideas really came from. Like some people are more important on this part, some people are more important on that. It's a weird interdisciplinary thing that, of course, there are many people from many fields, but you also slowly develop this idea that you need to be in your field, but with one eye to what you've heard other people say. So you already try to bring that into your presentation. And yeah, I don't know what we do. It's kind of like that. Yeah, no, it really works. And I mean, somehow it's a good test. Like if you can work with many people from different political fronts in writing, which is something, it's already hard, right? Marx had one co-author, like we have like 12, 13, like it's really hard to write together. I think it's already a good sign. So for example, that crazy diagram we had here, this one, we used it to slice it and say, okay, some people here are studying anthropology. That means you study mode A, perhaps with connection to mode C, and then you start seeing how you map different researches as kind of different parts of the same elephant. And then we wrote like really long texts together because we knew how to stitch together things that don't really go straight together, you know? So that's really helpful also to organize ourselves. Yeah, everyone here is invited, guys. If you want to come every Monday, I know it's very late here. Fatima, you know, is work very late at night to actually join the group. I think it starts 10 o'clock. Holy shit! Yeah, so it's very late here. 3 hours, yeah. But no, you don't need to go every time. Like just, you know, sleep well the night before and come once, and perhaps you like it. Yeah, dude. Yeah. Sure, no, I'm. No.
Okay, yeah, thank. This is, I thought this was brilliant and really illuminating. I just, so my question is about the relationship, well, I can put my question very simply that in a way that sounds stupid, and I'll try to explain the more interesting sense of the question. Is the logic of peripherization itself structural or conjunctural? Because there's a sense in which, if you're, from a Marxist perspective, one would say that what you're describing, the formal tools you're deploying, to map the logic of peripherization and to try, to make these illuminating distinctions between worlds and between the alignments and non-alignment of worlds is itself the result of a historical conjuncture. I mean, you look around, it's a reflection. It's a kind of a sophisticated, theoretical reflection upon a specific historical conjuncture. You can see this kind of, and so you're proposing a system of kind of tools to align theory and practice, okay, to gain conceptual traction upon these complicated dynamics, which extant left theories fail to track, and these political impasses follow. So my question is, if this is what you're doing, because there's a sense in which, in a way, this, the questions about the ways in which alignment. Look, if you're an orthodox Marxist, you would say that ultimately, the value form or the logic of value is the kind of the matrix through which these kind of the connections and even the alignments and misalignments is governed. In other words, they will apply. They say there is a totality. There's a social totality, and this the articulation of these worlds is determined in the last instance by the logic of value or something like this. Now, and I think you're right to point out how there's a sense in which that it's too coarse-grained, and in a way that the kind of the problem that value theory runs into is that it gives you this, the gain at the level of concrete abstraction leads to a debility at the level of politics. You end up with this kind of these romantic politics about, the abolition of value becomes as nebulous as, reuniting with the divine or whatever. It just becomes really kind of, so there is no strategy for the abolition of value. And communization theory tends to run into these problems. So the question is, if you're, it's really about, also the question of class struggle ties into this, about the primacy afforded to class struggle. If you've got, ultimately, the standard Marxist claim would be is that this kind of the antagonism of class cuts across all these, so that even at the level of affinity, at the level of, any kind of struggle in any community or any communal conflict, that you need to kind of to understand the logic of affinity to kind of really track the dynamics. At the same time, you need to understand how it's enveloped, by law, property, and value and commodity. But that then, so the question is, how would you start? Because I can see why you might want to resist that, the kind of the standard Marxist totalization, because you say, well, the whole point of this analysis is not to kind of collapse simply to subordinate A and B to C, because we have to understand the complexity of the non-alignments hinge on degrees of separation. But then when you're trying to connect tactically or strategically, and the political decisions, the political alliances to be made, at some point, a struggle, whether class or community, whether class or race or gender. Yes, there are situations in which those can be fused together, and it's important to be able to you have to be able to disintegrate them, but in a way that distinction between communism and liberalism is about some point, kind of a commitment. There's a basic commitment to emancipation, which can't be restricted, to the horizon of say, of race or gender. Okay, so you want to abolish these categories. You want to abolish, in other words, if you're a communist, there are categorical forms that you're committed to abolishing. Okay, and that's what it means. You want to kind of, the point is that you want to, to transform these worlds with a view of abolishing them in, some radical sense. And so this is the question about the sense in which communism comes into play in this political strategy. Because, as there are some people who are resistant or hostile to the term. Politics for Badiou is the politics of separation. And he, the reducibility of politics to the political is that politics is about, delinking, unbinding, and, the promise of communism, of the generic is is harbored by this kind of the logic of unbinding. And this is a powerful kind of response to the collapse of a kind of crude, mechanical programmatism,
Yeah.
Now, I think that you correct in a way. I think you're right to be wary of the pathos of the invent in Badiou. So what your theory provides is this really much more kind of fine-grained analytic machinery to track the intrication of distinct forms. Then the question is, is there an ultimate communist orientation?
Mm-hmm.
Is there an ultimate communist orientation?
No, I get the question. Yeah, so first the peripherization thing, the way I would put it, just in two parts, I would say first, like theoretically speaking, what we would claim is that misalignment is structural and modernity is not a constitutive concept of capitalism. Modernity is a moment. It might not happen. We could have had a capitalist system that never had modernity. It would be fine. I mean, like very, very small groups of people living in towers with immense richness, with no urban development around them, just logistical space for industrial. We could have had that. We couldn't have had the capitalism without periphery. So periphery is constitutive, centers are contingent. So that's the big different claim. But peripherization is not a necessity. If the world was much bigger, or if we already had spaceships to extract minerals from meteorites, probably we could keep the game going further. I don't know. I mean, regardless of that's been a good or bad thing. So peripherization is not conjunctural in the sense that misaligned peripheral atoms are structural to capitalism, but that we are living a peripherization period where there is this kind of expansion of that form that's conjunctural because it has very geopolitical material basis behind it that could have been otherwise, for sure. So that's the first thing. But there is an interesting thing, which, I mean, this is an amazing thing. I mean, probably 3 people in the world care about this, but it's really amazing that if you open books today of this new, I mean, we're living through a period where people who are worried about the structure of mathematics as what does mathematics have in common? They speak in very similar ways as the communists. Something happened that formal thinking is in a moment where it's concerned with how do you bring together different structures in a non-foundational way, in such a way that these things can, have similarities and differences, but equivalence is a relative regional category, identity needs to be started with. So it's a problem we've had politically since the beginning of the century. Mathematics caught up with it. So perhaps it's not for nothing that these tools are, we can pose the problem now. At the same time, I don't think it's for nothing that the problem is posed in peripheral countries and not in central countries. I find that, for example, debates about the future is ending, the end of history, the future is no longer there, they're usually being developed in the center where the world is shrinking and you no longer see that idea of modernity is being developed in the way that we thought it would be appearing. And you have this weird paradoxical defense of modernity, but it's almost reactive because you already know what you want. It already happened, right? You want more of something you already have. In peripheral countries, we're not discussing that. We're discussing other things, like from the Fisherian argument about, modern popular culture is weakening. Like in Brazil, it's not. Like it's not true. I don't know. So it's weird. It's not so generalizable. So I think that there is a specific conjuncture, and you can account for this, I think. Why it's appearing, where it's appearing, these discussions. Like why, for example, in Brazil, we have a really big debate about what does it mean to organize, organizational theory, new takes on these things. Why is it appearing there? Why are we here talking about this and not elsewhere? I think that we can give a pretty good conjunctural reason why we can capture certain structural traits now rather than some other time. This leads nicely to the problem of communism because, for example, a guy I think it's a good representative, 2 guys that I think are good representatives of the 4th quadrant before our own little stuff. One is very old, which is Alexander Bogdanov, Lenin's, nemesis or whatever, who was a ridiculous genius. Bogdanov had 2 really good things about him. The first is that he had a theory which has these properties. all social systems are organized systems. There is no absolute disorganization, so he will never accept the idea that something that happens outside of a standard capitalist structure is not organized, so it has some similarities. And he also thinks politics based on organization, not on other principles. So he has that homogeneity, it's very structural. And he also has an added idea, which I like, even though it's not how he's usually presented, which is that he has a theory of cognition through the resistance of one organization to another. So he says the vulgar version is that you learn through labor and the resistance. He was the first Lacanian in that sense. His literal statement is that the real is what resists to labor. And if you think labor in terms of organization, like the real resists to formalization, it's already there with the advantage that the real is also organized. So it already solves a Lacanian problem in 1913. But that idea, I think it's the basis for how we think this. I think basically this is why I showed this really weird diagram here with you see like with this organizational point of view. And it's the one that gives you the determination of the three logics, because we only learn what these logics are by the things we do that resist them. When you try to do something and the police appears, you quickly learn what the state is, right? When you try to do something and the money runs out, you really quickly realize what money is and the role it has in your life. So the way that you resist social logics is how we learn that those social logics exist. So communism comes first. The theory of the critique of political economy comes later. And you have also a nice inversion for us even further, because this is not a critical project. For us, this space of how we can organize, it's broader than the world we live in. The space of possible ways of organizing is bigger. So even if it's just a small example, like a small commune, it's still inhabiting a space that you need more rules to describe it than you need to describe entire countries. To describe entire countries, you need like profit, families need to have food, and state needs to preserve the rule of law. But to describe what people organize in a commune, you need like very specific things about what happened in that place. So you need a bigger formal space than the one where the capitalist world fits in. So for us, instead of critical thinking, we think in terms of you need to build a formal space, a theoretical space, which we think is a communist point of view, within which capitalism is a region. It's like a weaker form of organizing. It's a poorer type of thinking versus a bigger space that you can think more stuff, right? So for us, it's building to the point of view that looks at this difference and says it could be other differences could make a difference. They could be stitched together to form bigger systems, right? That point of view is the communist point of view. Then prescriptively, it comes with the things we were talking about, because if you then think communism has to do with composing things under non-trivial ways into bigger things where differences that didn't make a difference, you have a criteria for evaluate that it's kind of experimental. You claim a communist hypothesis that other differences can make a difference when we live together. Okay, let's see if that's true. Try to do it, see what happens. If it does, then we can see, if other things follow from that. And by this Bogdanovian principle that through resistance, you learn about the world, that's how we learn about what's out there. So it has a nice epistemological and a political side. Epistemologically, the point of view of communism is the point of view that politics thinks. We think the world we're in, when we do stuff, the world resists. Then you learn something about the world. Then you try to connect with other political experiences. Most social theory was born this way. Most social theory starts with somebody doing something wrong somewhere, and then somebody says, okay, I need to turn this into a theory so this doesn't happen again, right? So that it does happen again. So usually there's a political basis for social theory anyway. So you can account for that now. We do have a theory for how this happens. So I'd say communist prescription for us, it needs to be a bit abstract, because you don't want to suppose you can do strategy outside of context. But it has a metapolitical claim, which is whatever you do, be wary that it needs to compose together with what's happening elsewhere. And this requires you to approach it differently. And that you will probably get a different description of the world by doing that. And you can also track if you're moving forward if this description matches and composes, stitches itself, as I said, with those of others. So it's weird because it doesn't sound like a prescription the way that we're used to, like abolish value. But it leads to the same situation, because if to explain our social lives, you cannot refer to value as the main way of justifying, I did it because I need money to survive. If most of your time you spend saying you did it for other reasons, you don't live in capitalism, right? So that's the first thing. And then just to connect with the other point, the orthodox Marxist description is totally compatible, because, for example, misaligned atoms, Brazil is a really good example of this. You'll have like a totally disintegrated infrastructure for life and a pristine road for commodities to pass. Because capital is just, well, yeah, it seems like you guys know something about that, you know? Why? Because what makes a difference for capital is preserved. What makes a difference for living systems around it doesn't really make sense. So misaligned atoms actually show the logic of value even further. So you see everything else is kind of fractured. Just the road for the train track is maintained, right? So that's preserved with the advantage that you, for example, you can account for the fact that to make a supply chain work and keep it kind of functional, you need in one place the mafia, in the other place you need a religious group to side with the government, in another place you need, deep kind of segregation of populations, or you need slavery, or no, you need like really bourgeois, high, tall glass buildings to work. So we can now include that in our description, but the continuous line is preserved. But you just, as you said exactly, it's just not that coarse-grained. I do think that there is immense theoretical benefit in not starting from labor, because today we live this paradox where most value theory wants to criticize labor as a transhistorical category, but usually to do that, it becomes very reactive to workers' movements, as if it's already problematic, which is, I mean, come on, that makes no sense. So you need a bigger theory, because ultimately work is a type of organization. You don't create matter. You just restitch matter under certain principles, right? So you can actually decompose. Work is not a primitive category in our frame, but it is how you name socially effective transformation under the logic of value and property, especially. Like if you're working with properties that are where being a commodity makes a difference and value needs to be preserved, whatever it is that you're doing will look like value, like labor, right? So you recuperate that, you just don't start from it. So I think ultimately it remains compatible. And the last point on class, what is really nice about this is that, okay, we say from the standpoint of capital, meaning what makes a difference for capital, not for me, clearly the set of workers or set of people who don't own the means of production, that makes a difference. Knowing what's happening to this group as a totality changes the value of wages, changes a lot of things, right? So class, I'm not sure how you want to call it, but class composition, meaning that people are composed by capital as a class, clearly is happening, but given the interests of people and this social fracture, class formation is blocked. So you can have composition without class formation, and the very thing that binds people as class is what sets them apart as interest groups. So, I mean, this happens all the time. You're clearly working class, you're economically on the same boat as immigrant workers, but your interests are legitimately different, and you're fighting with them more than you're fighting with, the economic forces that determine both of you. So it follows from the logic of peripherization that class formation and class composition can be distinguished. And then it's easier to prescribe that, well, it's a communist task to align those two things somehow. Perhaps not align, it's not, since we're already using it as a technical term, but you need to stitch these things together. And I think another thing that becomes a bit better in that case is that becomes obvious that organizing people increases your problems, doesn't decrease your problems. When you organize, people hate each other much more. There is a reason why class formation it's not happening. So once you bring people into the same room, they're coming from life worlds that are different. They don't understand each other at a very basic existential level, right? So that's, again, a new task I don't think communists are very good at this. Usually we think that if we just name the bedrock, we're all workers, people are just going to say, okay, then let's just work together. But it's not the case, because some people will understand male workers and they will feel excluded, rightly so, because it's true that they're excluded. Some people will think you're talking gibberish because you're just a pedantic academic, and they're also right. Some people will say, yeah, so let's take the streets and strike because they think you're a Trotskyist and you're just going back in time, and that's also not going to work. So it's a mess, right? So we can track this a bit better as well. So it doesn't remove the perspective of class. On the contrary, I think it allows us to bring it back, center class again. Clearly is a fundamental problem. But the very fact that the construction of class in peripheral situations blocks class formation, is the reason why often you need to work with other words. You don't need, I think we need to probably abandon the word class to be able to be classist. But you can only do this if you have a way of knowing if you're thinking about class in real everyday practice. So you need something which is not a discourse or an identity or something like this. So I think that's what we're also trying to do. You need to think of these terms, which are usually used to describe very big structures. We know how to call, if you open Capital, all categories are like social relation, organic composition. But that meme, is organic composition in the room with us right now? It's big macro scale category. It doesn't translate into organization. How do you know if you're doing something on the side of value or not? How does class exist phenomenologically? It's totally blocked. You don't know. So this thing, it's also helpful with that, because if you look at something you're doing and the differences that make a difference are preserving certain structures of how commodity is organized, you can probably see that you're not touching on that. So I think it's more mobilizable, but there's still definitely a lot of work in that direction. I just think, generally speaking, communist orientation becomes kind of this underlying principle that I think the best way of putting is this: if you want to know about social reality, you need to resist it collectively. When you organize collectively, you mobilize these different logics. When you mobilize these different logics in a non-trivial way, you will find some resistance that will teach you about the world you're in for real, not in the books, right? And you can evaluate if you're moving forward by seeing if you're composing heterogeneous part of the world in a non-trivial way. That's pretty much the definition of communists from the book itself, right? Binding together struggles that are in different places with different logics. I think it's standard, but it's weird to find it in a way that can be, brought to the micro level like this, and it becomes a more scalable definition, I think, also. For example, we can imagine a situation where there's still capitalist enterprises around, but they're just isolated. Like having guilds today, it's kind of very cringe and anachronistic. You just be like this: the world is full of other stuff. You trust other norms to make sure things happen for you, but then there are those people who still want money, and you're like, yeah, that's abolishing value. You don't need to kill everyone to have done it, So you can. It becomes easier to think about that. Yeah, guys, I never stopped speaking. I'm sorry.